Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a high-stakes legal thriller that strikes right at the absolute heart of how a democracy balances its power. We're going to break down a massive constitutional clash from 2025 involving the state of Tamil Nadu, the governor's office, and the Supreme Court of India. At its core, this is a story about the rules of the game when laws are made, and what actually happens when the referees themselves decide to just stop the clock, essentially freezing the will of the voters. Okay, let's dive into this. We're starting with an incredibly compelling question. Can an unelected official effectively veto a democratically passed law using nothing but their own silence? I know, it kind of sounds like a loophole in a board game, right? But this omission of text, specifically the lack of a deadline, created an enormous amount of real-world power. We're going to explore exactly how this happened and how the highest court in the land had to step in to untangle the whole shebang.
Section 1. The Governor's Dilemma. To understand how the system broke down, we first need to look at the constitutional rulebook. As a component part of the state legislature under Article 168, here's how the mechanics are supposed to work for the governor. When an elected assembly passes a bill, it goes to them. Article 200 of the Constitution gives the governor three clear options: grant assent so the bill becomes law, withhold assent and return it for reconsideration, or reserve the bill for the President of India's consideration under Article 201. Three clear, distinct options. But, well, here is where the plot thickens. Take a look at this massive loophole. Article 200 prescribes absolutely no timeline for the governor to actually make that choice. None. There's no ticking clock in the constitutional text telling the governor they have 30 days or 60 days or a year to pick one of those three options. It's just a blank space. And as you probably know, in constitutional law, a blank space like that is basically an open invitation for unexplained, prolonged inaction. That textual gap creates what's called a de facto veto, or more commonly, a pocket veto. This is when an executive official essentially takes a piece of legislation, puts it in their pocket, and just walks away. By using indefinite silence and inaction, they kill the bill without ever having to formally veto it or explain themselves to the legislature. It effectively silences the voice of the voters who elected that assembly, transforming a seemingly abstract legal gap into a very tangible threat. Section 2. The Tamil Nadu Crackdown. To see what this delay looks like in practice, let's walk through the timeline of the Tamil Nadu crisis. On day one, the state assembly passes several bills, but then, crickets. For over a year, the governor takes absolutely no action. Over a year of pure silence. Eventually, the bills are returned, and the assembly quickly repasses them in the exact same form. But instead of granting assent the second time around, which the state argued was constitutionally required, the governor takes a different route and reserves them for the president. As you can imagine, this prolonged inaction deeply frustrated the elected representatives and triggered a massive legal showdown. So the crucial point here is how the courts have historically viewed this kind of discretion. As the landmark Rameshwar Prasad case highlights, constitutional discretion must be exercised in good faith and within a reasonable time. The underlying legal principle is that even when a power is textually unqualified, like even when there's no strict deadline actually written down, that power literally cannot be used in a way that defeats the very purpose of the provision itself. And that brings us to the explosive April 2025 ruling in the case of State of Tamil Nadu v. Governor of Tamil Nadu. The two-judge bench of the Supreme Court essentially slammed the door shut on the pocket veto. They officially read an implicit, reasonable time requirement right into Article 200. Plus, because the unexplained delay defeated the Constitution's purpose, the court took the incredible step of using its extraordinary powers under Article 142 to just deem that assent was granted to those stalled bills. They basically said, time's up. This brilliantly illustrates the core reasoning of the court. It's a classic constitutional balancing act between the governor, an unelected constitutional functionary who's generally bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, and the representative government, which is the elected assembly. The court reasoned that if you permit indefinite inaction, you are allowing an unelected official to completely nullify representative government. To the court, that was a direct violation of the basic structure and foundation of our democracy. Section 3. The November Presidential Pivot. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is that the story didn't actually end in April. We got a fascinating plot twist in November via a presidential reference under Article 143. While the April ruling by a two-judge bench was incredibly strict, imposing implied timelines, allowing zero silence, and shutting down post-repassage reservations, a larger five-judge bench in November introduced a much more nuanced view. They held that the power to reserve a bill absolutely does survive repassage, provided federal concerns are at play. The five-judge bench determined that when a bill is amended and repassed, the governor actually performs a genuine constitutional screening function by comparing the original and amended versions. If there are valid federal or intrastate concerns, the governor retains the discretion to reserve it for the president. Crucially, the bench also ruled that the president's discretion under Article 201 is non-judiciable. That means it is entirely beyond the court's power to review. Because the president is the head of state assessing those federal implications, their timeline just isn't subject to the same strict judicial clock as a state governor's.
Section 4. Weighing the counterarguments.
Okay, let's play referee for a second and objectively lay out the fierce criticisms directed at both of these major rulings. Critics of the strict April judgment argue that by reading an implied timeline into the Constitution, the court basically engaged in judicial overreach. They say the court legislated a procedural rule that just isn't in the text, encroaching on the separation of powers. On the flip side, critics of the November reference argue that giving the governor broader discretion revives the exact risk of endless delay that the April ruling tried to kill. Furthermore, they argue that making the president's discretion unreviewable leaves executive inaction with absolutely no judicial check at all.
Section 5. The end of pocket vetoes.
So where does all of this complex legal maneuvering leave us today? Well, despite the heavy debates and the differing nuances between the April and November rulings, there is one rock-solid, settled consensus to carry forward. An absolute or indefinite pocket veto has absolutely no place in the constitutional scheme, period. The days of a governor using pure silence and endless inaction as a tool of legislative obstruction, those are firmly over. Both judicial pronouncements completely agree on this fundamental democratic baseline. What we're actually left with is a recalibrated middle position. Governors do retain genuine discretion, but it's not unlimited. They are allowed to exercise legitimate constitutional vigilance, meaning they can screen bills for demonstrable federal or interstate concerns and reserve them for the president. But they are strictly barred from disguised delay. Basically, they can't just slap a federal concern label on a bill as a handy excuse to obstruct the elected assembly indefinitely. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. In the future, when a governor inevitably invokes a federal concern justification to reserve a bill after a really long delay, how exactly will the courts distinguish legitimate constitutional vigilance from disguised delay? That is the unresolved question, and it's undoubtedly going to be the next great constitutional battleground. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions and keep analyzing the rules that govern our democracy.